Chapter 39. Where is home? Proverbs 24, verse 47. Put your outdoor work in order and get your fields ready. After that, build your house. Where is home? It seems like a simple question, doesn't it? We tried to take a quick trip back to Canada whenever we were in Florida restocking. Sometimes the most economical way to do that was to fly into Seattle and rent a car for the drive to Canada. This particular trip, we arrived at the border at night. I was tired, and that may have contributed to the problem. As we pulled up to the Canada Customs booth, the first thing the agent asked was, "Where is home?" The question threw me, and I hesitated. Where was home? We were Canadian. Ingrid's parents lived in Abbotsford, British Columbia, and mine lived in Chilliwack, British Columbia. We had lived in Vernon, British Columbia, before getting on the boat. The boat was currently in Fort Pierce, Florida, and we often thought of that as home those days, as it had become our home port. But we spent most of our time in Haiti, and it had been there several years. All of this flashed through my tired mind when he asked the question. He noticed my hesitation before I answered. "We are going home to Chilliwack." That was the wrong answer, apparently. His next question was, "Are you all Canadian?" To which my answer was, "Yes." His response was, "You are driving a car registered in Washington State. You, as a Canadian, cannot bring a U.S. vehicle into Canada unless you are importing it. Pull over and go inside." So in we went to deal with it. The person inside was actually very helpful. We explained our story to her, and she gave us the answer to use for future crossings into Canada to avoid the issue of Canadians bringing a U.S. car into Canada. The phrase they needed to hear was that we were expatriate, non-resident Canadians, currently out of Florida. We used that phrase in the future, and it worked like a charm. But the question still remained. Where is home? The answer was that the boat was home. Yes, it was an unusual home. The boat was built in 1954 for the Canadian Navy. It was reconfigured in 1959 and changed to an YMR class vessel. The YMR designation stood for Marine Research. There is an area on Canada's west coast designated as Whiskey Gulf on ocean charts. This was a joint U.S.-Canadian torpedo test range. It was home for the boat for many years. Marine research in this case meant torpedo and sonar testing. The boat was used to track subs and their torpedoes in the test range. It then spent its last few years as a training vessel and was given the name Navigator.
CHAPTERA.
It was the name of an officer on one of the original boats that explored the west coast of Canada. There is also an inlet on the west coast called
CHAPTERA.
Arm, where the boat used to travel during its training runs. The CHAPTERA weighed in at 80 tons and was 75 feet long. It had its original 1954 twin NH220 six-cylinder Cummins diesel motors. They were monsters that occupied the 12-foot by 18-foot engine room. Maximum RPM was governed at 1,850 RPMs, but we cruised at 1,250 RPMs. At that engine speed, you could travel for days at sea with the engines purring away. However, to propel a boat of this size at cruising speed took about 1 gallon of fuel for every mile traveled. The engine room was amidships with watertight bulkheads on both ends. Theoretically, you could cut the boat in half, and both halves would continue to float. Forward of the engine room, below decks, was the galley, kitchen, and dining area, and walking through the dining area took you to the forward bedroom with 4 bunks. Aft, from the engine room below decks, were 4 bunk rooms. The first 2 rooms had 3 bunks each, which we later reduced to 2, and the second 2 had 2 bunks each. Passing through these rooms brought you to a large aft cabin with low headroom. This room had 2 beds and was shared by the children for the first few years. When they got a little older, they moved to their own rooms, taking the first 2 rooms when you first entered the aft cabin. On deck forward over the galley area was the pilot house, and Ingrid and I had the rear on deck cabin. This rear cabin connected directly to the children's room below by way of a large hatch and ladder. As on any cruising boat, there are 3 main challenges, limitations that have to be sorted out. My family was used to these limitations, but guests had to adjust to them quickly. The first issue was electricity. We had a generator, and as a rule, it ran 2 hours every morning and 2 hours every evening. The boat had dual power. There was 110 volt power when the generator was on, and there was 12 volt power the rest of the time. There were large battery banks in the engine room that the generator charged with a backup charging system from the engines that we wired in after the first year, plus each engine had its own battery bank for starting. Groups on board had to learn the restrictions to the amount of power available. We did not allow the use of blow dryers or curling irons on board as they required too much power. Water was a valuable commodity. We had 2 water systems. The shower could be run on either the tanks filled by rain or shore water, or it could run on the tanks filled by the reverse osmosis system. The RO water system was restricted by generator time. The kitchen and bedroom sinks all used the RO water. Groups had to learn to live with closely monitored water restrictions. Toilets used salt water only. The final challenge was refrigeration, which only ran for the 4 hours each day that the generator ran. The fridge system had to operate with that restriction. It was always a problem in the tropics, and we went through a number of systems. During one trip to Florida, we were given the parts to build a custom-built system complete with compressors that sat in the engine room with and coolant lines that ran to cold holding plates mounted in double ice boxes that we built for them in the galley area. The boat was made of wood and was massively built. It did, however, require constant maintenance. It was home. Chapter 40, The School in Laocoon. Isaiah 28, verse 16. So this is what the sovereign Lord says. See, I lay a stone in Zion, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone for a sure foundation. I have written in general terms about the school in Laocoon. This project took tremendous cooperation and determination and a number of years to complete. The first step was legally acquiring the land and registering it in a way that it would be a benefit for the community in the future so that no one could claim to own it. This was done through Free Ed and Missionary Ventures, the organization Ed worked with. Next, the land was cleared where the buildings would go. Some good-sized trees came down. Those trees were cut down by hand sawn into planks, and then cut into usable lumber. That lumber was then used to make desks for the school. Then the hard work began. The trenches for the footings were all dug by hand. While this was happening, we began stockpiling materials and making concrete blocks for use in the walls. The blocks were made by hand using a block form and hand-mixed concrete. We made them in lots so that we had enough blocks ready for each stage. We made them ourselves to ensure strength. Many of the blocks available in Haiti had nowhere near enough cement in them. We made 8,000 blocks in the first run. It was a lot of hard work. The footings were then completed with 2-foot wide rock walls built on them to bring us up to grade. Rebar was used throughout. That is why the school stood through the earthquakes that hit the area years later. Funding was always an issue. Both our organization and Free Ed were working on the money end. As we bought materials and hired labor, whoever had money that week paid for things. Occasionally, construction work would take a break while the money caught up. There was always pressure, mostly on me from myself, to keep the project moving ahead. The problem was that the school was growing even while we were building. We had kids going to school under tarps and all sorts of places that were never meant to be schoolrooms. Finding lumber of any kind in Haiti then was a challenge. That's the reason we created lumber from the trees we cut down. Labor was cheap, but lumber was not. One of the biggest problems was finding lumber of sufficient quality and quantity for the roof trusses. We traveled far and wide in that beater truck of mine, buying what we could. I had some power tools on the boat and portable generators to power them, but the Haitians had no experience working with power equipment and no clue about the concept of care and maintenance of equipment. So most of the work was done by hand, Haitian style. I was amazed by how much they could do with so little. Whenever power tools came out, an audience would begin to gather out of curiosity. We did not wait for rooms to be finished for classes to move in. I would show up to work in an area only to find that a class had moved in during the early hours. No floors, no finished roof, and bare block walls with a tarp stretched across the shade. With time, funds came in and the sections were finished one by one. As each section was stuccoed, Jordan and I painted. It was a Haitian-style school with open, well-ventilated rooms, but I wanted it to look as good as possible. So we went that extra mile to dress it up a bit. Jordan and I painted the walls and taped off all the lines. A guest of Free Ed's painted a map of Haiti on the wall outside the school office. On the inside hallway, we had a large world map under plexiglass. The maps were on prominent display for adults and children to learn more about geography. The sad reality, when they were first put up, was that no one, adults or students, could point out where they lived on the map of Haiti, and no one could point to Haiti on the world map. That's why we built schools and why maps were on the walls. 41. Flat out Lamar. Romans 15:13. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. About a 15-minute drive from Ibo was another mission base, which was run by a fellow named Lamar from Pennsylvania. Our first introduction to Lamar was on a Saturday morning at Ibo. A small aluminum runabout boat came flying by us at the anchorage. This was unusual in itself, but in the boat was a white man and his sons. We didn't meet with him that day, we just saw him fly by. Every time we saw him in the future, always on a Saturday, his day off, he was at full speed in that boat. We eventually got to know each other, and each of us learned about what the other did. One day, Lamar got into his little aluminum boat and made the run across miles of open water to find us at Opak. It was not a calm day on the water. There was a decent chop for a small boat. This did not deter Lamar. He came at his usual speed, flat out. When he arrived, his boat was leaking badly. He had taken such a pounding at full power that several of rivets in his aluminum boat were opening. Not to be slowed down, we hauled the boat up onto the beach to remove the motor and put the boat on its side. We then beat the rivets back together with hammers. Later that day, after seeing Opak, he headed back across the open water, going flat out once again. So he acquired his nickname, Flat Out Lamar. Knowing our work, Lamar came to us with a proposal to organize and run a massive regional clinic out of Opak as a joint outreach with his organization and others he knew in Haiti. This was an unusual proposal because of who he and his associated groups were. They came from a very conservative group, Pennsylvania Dutch, conservative Mennonite, and Amish roots. We were pretty worldly by their standards and very different culturally to be accepted by them, but Lamar was determined to bring us all together. As it turned out, we had an absolute blast with them. They arrived with truckloads of supplies, which we loaded on board. He had called in nurses from remote mountain villages and other missionaries who were used to working remote areas. We all packed aboard and headed out. Lamar came with his little boat, and Jordan hitched a ride with him. My son loved adventure, and a flat-out trip across the open water with Lamar was right up his alley. As I said, these people came from very conservative backgrounds. We wore shorts, and their female nurses wore long dresses, and the men wore long pants. The women explained to Ingrid that they came from a liberal sect. They were allowed colored dresses, not just black, but no patterns. The people of the region had heard we were coming to run a clinic, and they came by the boatload from all over. We were overwhelmed by the numbers. Lamar ran a triage system, organizing the crowds into groups based on the greatest need. One room in the church was set up as a pharmacy, and dividers formed examination rooms. The first morning, we needed major crowd control. People were desperate to get help. They literally would have torn the doors off the church if not for Lamar keeping order. Our goal was to see and help them all, but it seemed they just kept coming. We had planned on being there for several days, and we would need that time to see everyone. The clinic was a huge success, but before we headed back to Ibo, it was playtime. Everyone had worked very hard and needed to be refreshed. We had our skiff, and Lamar had his aluminum runabout. We had a knee board and some old water skis on board. The kids and men put on shorts and were in the water and were making turns skiing and boarding. Finally, the women had had enough watching. The most daring of them went first. She was wearing her dress, but reached down and tied the skin and tied the skin part of the dress up between her legs and threw herself off the bow into the water. The others followed her lead, and soon the entire group was enjoying the water. It was a sight to see. Lamar was inspired by the boat and boating. He bought an old 15-foot tri-hull ski boat and had it loaded into a shipping container full of rice. The container was shipped from the States, and flat out Lamar had a faster and bigger toy. He could be seen on Saturdays screaming by in this boat, towing his sons on skis. As the country continued into chaos in the coming years, many organizations ordered their people out of the country for safety. One day Lamar and his crew were told that they all had to leave immediately. He asked me if he could sell us his boat at a ridiculously low price. We made the deal, dismantled the boat trailer, and loaded it into the top deck, and tied up our new toy behind us. Our other boats were light enough that we could lift them onto the boat when traveling at sea. One would hang on the rear davits off the stern, and the rest went on the top deck. The skiff had its own cradle on the top deck, and we had built an assembly that lifted it up there. This new boat would have to be towed everywhere. This was a mild irritation in Haiti, but at one point we would have to tow it all the way back to Florida, across the Windward Passage and miles of open ocean. That would be a challenge. Chapter 42, Old Testament Justice and Into Chaos. John 8, verse 7. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." I've talked about that first day in Haiti back in December 1995, when we flew in for the first time. Walking through the streets, an angry mob had formed quickly. They had caught a man stealing rice from a street vendor and had grabbed 6-foot lengths of sugar cane and were beating him to death with them on the street. I saw this in the first hour of exploring. I would like to say that this was rare and was the worst that I had saw, but it was not. My goal here is not to be graphic or get into details, but rather to help you understand the realities of where we were. I tell of these stories in no particular time order. The first I did not witness, but telling of the aftermath that I saw will give you a glimpse into the daily realities that there really was no one running things in this country. On this particular day, we were heading to Grace Children's Hospital, which was a children's AIDS and TB hospital in Port-au-Prince, with a group from Fort Pierce. In fact, it was a fateful day that we met Friette again. It was morning, and we were in a busy area of town, and there were plenty of people about. On the roadside, with people stepping around him as they went about whatever they were doing, was the body of a man who had died of a violent death, possibly by machete, based on the volume of blood. I don't know why he was killed, only that he was. We were heading back to the boat about 4 hours later and passed by the same spot. The man's body was still lying there. There were no police, no ambulance, just a body that had been laying in the street for hours. The government of Haiti claimed there was no room in the jails, not enough police, and too much crime. They called their solution to the problem the zero tolerance policy. The basics were that the population should become vigilantes, and anyone they caught should be dealt with by the people immediately. If you had enemies, it became a very dangerous season in Haiti. The gangs that enforced the president's wishes and dealt in drug smuggling took this as permission to kill anyone that expressed opposition to the government with the assurance that the police would not pursue them. Mob justice would become the rule. The mob would catch someone they were after, and an old tire would be forced down over the victim's head and shoulders until it pinned his arms to his body. Gas was then poured over the tire and the victim, and he was lit on fire. The victim would jump around briefly as he burned, and then fall to the ground burning until the tire was burned up, which was a long time. I was heading to Port-au-Prince one day with Lundy in his truck to buy rice. We were about 2 miles from the boat at the intersection of two dirt roads when we came across a mob of people who were dragging a man with them. They had caught him stealing. He had taken an old beat-up bicycle and the wheelbarrow he was carrying it with when he was caught. They were dragging him down the road and were getting a tire and gas. Lundy wisely cautioned me not to interfere, as a mob mentally can go wild very quickly. The man was killed by the mob via necklacing. A young man who lived in the next village down from Ibo had mental development issues. He would walk down the shoreline past our anchored boat and would stop to visit on the dock on occasion. In Haiti, people who owned a cow did not actually own any land to keep it on. Instead, they would keep it staked out on a rope in the bushes or in a ditch by a roadside, any spot where the cow could find something to eat. They would move it each day to a new spot. One day, this mentally handicapped young man thought he should set a mooing cow free and was untying it when he was caught. A mob formed, but there was no tire around. They tied the man's hands and tied the end of the cow's rope around his neck in a noose and drove the cow, chasing it up and down the dirt road until the young man was strangled by the rope. Lundy and I came across him lying dead on the side of the dirt road on our return from Port-au-Prince that day. On another occasion, I was heading into Port-au-Prince, and on the edge of town, in an area called Bon Repos, a man's body was laying on the roadside. He had been necklaced, and his charred body was left where he dropped. What turned my stomach was the dog. This dog, who was clearly starving itself, was tearing open the dead man's abdomen and eating the burnt-out corpse. It was one of those images that stays in my mind. I wish it didn't. The list goes on, but I think you get the picture by now. Lawlessness does not create a peaceful society. It creates an atmosphere of fear and chaos. Given enough time and fear, the chaos can turn into anger. Given enough anger, you will eventually self-destruct. Haiti has a long and violent history. I have never looked it up to see if it holds any world records for most governments overthrown. It must hold some sort of record given that 28 presidents have been overthrown in coups and military takeover. The military was finally abolished to avoid it taking over the government again. Haiti was back in that cycle again, and the pressure cooker was heating up. The police were rarely seen, and rule by angry and opposing gangs began to be the reality as the country circled the drain yet one more time. The country became more dangerous, and that led mission organizations still operating to stop bringing in groups. As people became angrier, they attacked and broke anything that worked. phone lines, gas stations, schools. Then the more things stopped working, the more the chaos and anger grew. The United Nations had all but disappeared after it had held elections years back, and there was nothing there to stop the cycle of chaos. This was the atmosphere we worked during the last year or so in Haiti. As the country slid further into chaos, we stopped bringing groups in to work with us. They would be safe
opaque
or loud cool, but picking them up at the Port-au-Prince airport became too much of a risk. Kidnappings began to become more common. Most of the time we were in Haiti, whites were generally safe from violence, not from robbery, but they were usually not the target of gang or mob violence. That changed as kidnapping for ransoms began to occur, and as the police disappeared, the government stopped being able to pay them. The gangs began to enforce their laws and control different areas of the country. When driving the truck into for materials, I was always trying to see around the next corner to avoid roadblocks. They were usually set up near the edge of town to control what and who came into the town. The gangs who controlled each town carried old military-style automatic weapons. They wanted to make sure no one who wasn't part of their gang brought guns into the town to challenge them. When you came across a roadblock, you were pulled out of your vehicle and it was searched. If you had a gun in the vehicle, you would not expect to survive the roadblock. I managed to avoid being stopped except for one time, but that was enough. They liked to block the main road, so I got into the habit of taking the lower waterfront track. As we entered our last few years or so in Haiti, we had to keep making adjustments to maintain our security, and then ceasing having groups completely and spending less and less time in Ibo. We were clearly safer in La Cool and Au Pair, where the local people watched out for us. Chapter 43, Keeping the Tanks Full. Ezekiel 38, verse 7. Get ready, be prepared. You and all the hordes gather about you, and take command of them. We had a rule that we lived by in Haiti. Be ready to leave quickly on a moment's notice. This policy became more and more necessary as time progressed. Being ready to leave meant always having enough fuel in your tanks to get out. Getting fuel on board in Canada or the U.S. was easy. Find a commercial fuel dock or marina, pull up to the dock, and fill the tanks. Once you cross the line south of the U.S., all that changes. Traveling from Canada to Haiti, we like to keep our tanks topped up. It was just wise in so many ways. We were able to keep things fairly simple until Manzanillo in Mexico. They had a big concrete wharf to pull up to for fueling, but there were no fuel in the pumps. I had to go out and find an empty semi-truck with a tanker trailer and make a deal with the driver. We went to a regular gas station in town and opened one of the tanker hatches. Then at the diesel pump, we pumped whatever I needed to top off the boat. 500 gallons, if I remember correctly. Everything had to be paid in cash. We then pulled up beside the boat and ran the fuel into our tanks via gravity. The whole operation took hours. Another example of fueling up, one that became closer to the new norm, was our last stop in Mexico before crossing into Central American waters by a Mexican Navy frigate and searched, which I talked about in an earlier chapter. This stop was a tiny little harbor a few miles from the Guatemalan border. I had a cruising guide for Mexico on board. Otherwise, I probably would have figured things out. There was a lighthouse there, and the cruising guide said to contact Jimmy, the lightkeeper's son. Jimmy and his brother Johnny would not only get us fuel, but would drive us around for hours to get all the proper clearances to leave Mexico. We pulled in and asked for Jimmy and Lo, and behold, the guidebook was correct. Jimmy and his brother Johnny showed up. It was a 30-mile run to customs for our paperwork in Jimmy's beat-up truck. We had fuel drums stacked in the back and filled them up on the way back to the boat. Then back at the boat, we ran a siphon line to our tanks and let the fuel flow. For a few hours, we were the community's entertainment. Keeping our tanks full also included our water tanks. We collected rainwater off the top tanks in heavy rainfalls during rainy season, and we had a RO water maker, but that took time and money to operate. We carried 400 feet of water hose on board. One of the things we did on our visits to the mission in was get water. We would drop our front anchor and then back in toward the beach and put out a smaller anchor to hold the stern in closer to shore. The 400 feet of hose was then run ashore and connected to the mission's water system. They had an extremely deep well with pure cold water. We filled our tanks and any water jugs that may have been empty. While we were on the topic of filling tanks, let me also take a moment to talk about the other area that needed constant refilling, our finances. It was a reality that without cash flow, everything else would flow to a stop. Money was needed for fuel, rice, and beans for our feeding programs, for our church and school construction programs, for refitting and repairs in Florida. The list was both extensive and expensive. If one let it, you could get stressed out over the financing. Ingrid and I took this point of view. This was God's mission, not ours. Our job was to do the work and let people know what we were doing. God's job was to provide us with the funds and the people required to do the job. In the beginning of our time in Haiti, I didn't get that and spent hours and hours trying to figure out how to raise the funds we needed. Then I changed my point of view. We would simply do the work we felt called to do. And if the money didn't flow, we would pause to let it catch up. And if it still didn't flow, that would be our signal that it was time to go home. There was a time or two when things got pretty tight, but in general, it all seemed to work. We never had so much that we would feel we were set, but we also never, or rarely, felt like we were broke either. The money just always seemed to come as needed. Our board would sometimes tell us that we should treat ourselves, but we understood that much of the money we had often came from people who did not have much to start with, and we felt it was impossible for us to treat ourselves when those around us were going hungry. Overall, I was humbled by the way people supported us. The money that came in through Canada was handled by either our board or our home church in Canada. The money that came from the U.S. was handled by Common Ground Major Church in Fort Pierce. The one rule I had about donations was that I did not want to know who was giving what. I did not want to treat those who gave differently than those who didn't. Chapter 44, Fleeing by the Boatload. Matthew 11, verse 28. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. There was always a flow of people in Haiti trying to get to the U.S. Some would flee in overloaded boats, and some would convince the Canadian or U.S. Embassy to give them a tourist visa and never return. One year in Haiti, I realized that I had messed up with my Canadian passport. It was going to expire before our return to Florida. On one of my trips to Port-au-Prince, I went to the Canadian Embassy to see what could be done. The line to get in literally went around the block. Fortunately, I found a separate entrance that was there for Canadian citizens only. At the door, I was greeted by a Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer, aka Mounties for you Americans, which was a pleasant surprise. The officer took me straight into the embassy where they were able, in short order, to issue me a new passport. I was blessed with a new passport, but what stuck with me were the sheer number of people lining up trying to get a visa to Canada. Much of Haiti's goods travel within the country on fairly large and very rustic open wooden sailboats up to 40 to 50 feet long. There was a black market business in Haiti smuggling Haitians into Florida. These large sailing freight boats would be overloaded with too many people on board, making the mad dash for the beach in Florida. You may remember Lundy, my driver from Ibo. He had skippered refugee boats to Florida twice, being deported both times and going to jail one time. The odds of success were not high, but each time Haiti descended into chaos, the volume of people attempting the run went up. The boats were overloaded and not built for the open sea. Many boats sank and were never heard from again. Some shipwrecked in the Bahamas and scattered as the Bahamian Defense Force looked for them. Some were picked up at sea by the U.S. Coast Guard and returned to Haiti by sea. Some made it to the beach in Florida, trying to scatter before being caught. The majority of people trying to get to the U.S. this way failed, but they kept trying. The routes that we took to and from Haiti were common routes for refugee boats. The U.S. Coast Guard patrolled these waters constantly in search for these boats. While at sea one day, on the way between Georgetown and the northwest point of Haiti, I suddenly heard a terrible loud mechanical sound, like my engines were coming apart. I rushed into the engine room, but all was well. Coming up from the engine room, it was clear that the racket was coming directly above us now. A large U.S. Coast Guard helicopter was hovering right on top of us. I turned my radio to the proper channel and called them, asking them to move away so that I could hear them on the radio. They obliged and then proceeded to ask us questions. Who were we? Where were we going? Etc. We were in international waters and were a Canadian vessel, which means we could ignore them if we chose. But we considered them friends and gladly answered their questions. If we were ever to have a serious problem here at sea, it would be these air crews with the Coast Guard that would be the ones to come to our rescue. After talking with them for a while, they were off continuing their searching. The next morning, we were still at sea, and they flew by us again. They were making sure that we were going where we had told them. On another trip from Haiti to Florida, via the remote back route through the Bahamas, we came across a Haitian boat on its way westward trying to get to Florida. The boat was absolutely packed with people trying to escape the mess in Haiti. People in Haiti were constantly asking us to to get them into Florida. They were convinced we could successfully smuggle them in. We would explain that if we did take anyone and were caught, the boat would be seized and I would face a fine of $10,000 per Haitian on board and would be barred from the United States for life. We were not in the people transportation business. There was a fellow named Adler who was always helping us out. He would dive for lobsters and conch, which we would buy regularly. He would bring sick people out to the boat and was always willing to help with anything we asked of him. Adler was saving up any money he could to be able to get a Haitian passport. He was convinced that with a letter of reference and a passport, he would be able to get a visa. The reality of him getting one was remote at best, but he was determined. The most qualified and educated people were the ones who were successful in getting visas. They got visas for wherever they could. Their belief was that anywhere was better than Haiti. Janelle, the man who acted as the director of our school in Opak, was educated and spoke Creole, good French, and tolerable English. He was a good director and leader of his community, but he was still poor and living in harsh conditions. He managed to get out of Haiti to the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe and never returned. He was sorely missed, as finding a replacement to run the school was very difficult. This constant flow of Haiti's best out of the country was one of the country's ongoing issues. The problem was that this was just one of many faced by the country.